Right now, in the summer of 2026, people in 5 different American states are reporting the same thing. Something enormous, something covered in hair, walking upright through woods, across fields, along the edges of roads where it was never supposed to be. And they are not reporting it one at a time, spread out over the years, the way stories like this usually trickle in. They are reporting it all at once, in the same narrow window, in places that have almost no history of it.
Over the last few months, the reports have started climbing fast, and they have started climbing in the wrong places. States that were always quiet, states that barely register on the database, 5 of them lighting up together. What I can tell you is grounded and checkable. A cluster of credible reports across 5 named states inside the same season, documented well enough that mainstream press picked it up. A family on a drive, a man alone in his truck at night, hunters, hikers, ordinary people in ordinary places, all describing a tall, dark, upright figure within the same handful of weeks. And the descriptions line up in ways that are hard to coordinate by accident. The height, consistently enormous, 7 to 8 feet. The posture, upright and bipedal, not an animal on 4 legs reared up for a moment. The color, dark or reddish brown. The reaction, a kind of unhurried awareness. The figure noticing the witness and choosing to leave rather than fleeing in panic. Strangers in 5 states sketching the same creature from the same handful of details.
I'm Alex, and if this were just one strange report, I would not be making this video. One report can be just a fluke. One report is something you can explain away with a bad photograph or an overactive imagination. But this is not just one report. This is a cluster. And clusters behave differently. Clusters have shapes, and the shapes of this one does not make sense.
Here's the detail that should make you sit up. The reports out of Ohio this year did not stay on the fringe message boards where the stuff usually lives. They made the national news. CNN covered them. A folklorist and a working researcher were quoted side by side, treating a sudden spike in Bigfoot sightings as a genuine news event worth reporting. That almost never happens. Think about what it takes for that to happen. Bigfoot is the punchline the mainstream press reaches for when it wants something light. For a national network to send a reporter, map the encounters, and quote the people involved without the usual wink, the signal has to be loud. Loud enough that ignoring it started to look like the stranger choice. The coverage is not evidence of a creature. It is evidence that the surge was big enough and strange enough to drag the subject out of the joke section and onto the news. So we are left with a real question, and not a comfortable one. What makes sightings of the same creature surge across 5 separate states in the same season? What moves a phenomenon across half a continent at once? And why is it happening now, in 2026, in front of trail cameras and cell phones and a national audience? Let us go back to the beginning, to the first state where the map started breaking.
Forget whether you believe in Bigfoot for a second. The real question here is simpler and stranger. Why are so many people in so many places seeing the same thing at the same time? Before you understand why this is strange, you have to understand what normal looks like. Because Bigfoot sightings, for all their reputation as random backwoods nonsense, are not actually random. They follow a map. And that map has been remarkably consistent for a very long time, up until this year.
The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, the BFRO, has been collecting reports since 1995. Over that time, they have logged more than 5,000 documented sightings across the United States and Canada, each one investigated, classified, and pinned to a location. When you lay all of that data out, a clear pattern emerges. The sightings are not spread evenly, they pile up in specific places. Washington State leads everything, with around 724 reports on record. California sits behind it with roughly 463. Florida, with its swampy skunk ape variant, holds about 344. These are the strongholds. The Pacific Northwest in particular is the beating heart of the whole phenomenon. Dense old-growth forest, endless wilderness, and a century of stories. If you're a believer, this map makes sense. This is where the cover is thickest, where a large animal could move unseen, where the habitat could quietly support something big. If you are a skeptic, the map still makes sense because this is also where the culture is thickest, where people grow up on these stories and are primed to see them. Either way, the geography has rules. It is worth sitting with how stable that map has been. Decade after decade, the same regions dominate. People have tried to explain the clustering in every direction. Maybe it reflects where the animal could actually live. Maybe it reflects where people spend time in the right kind of country. Maybe it reflects nothing but local belief, a feedback loop of expectation. But whatever the cause, the distribution itself barely moved. The strongholds stayed the strongholds. Researchers have even tried to correct for population, asking whether a state has a lot of sightings simply because it has a lot of people looking. When you run that per capita test, the picture sharpens rather than dissolves. The signal tracks forest cover and rugged terrain more than it tracks raw headcount. Sparsely populated, heavily wooded country produces sightings out of proportion to the number of eyes available to see anything. The pattern is about the land, not just the crowd. That is the backdrop you have to hold in your head for the rest of this. A century of accounts, a database thousands of reports deep, and a geography that has stayed put through all of it. The map is not a guess. It is one of the few genuinely stable things in this entire strange subject, which is why, when it moves, you should pay attention. And maps like this do not usually move quickly. Think about how a sighting distribution actually shifts. New reports come in one at a time, and it takes years of them piling up before a region's standing on the map changes at all. A state climbs the rankings the way a glacier moves slowly over a long time as the count grinds upward. That is the normal tempo of this data, gradual, almost geological. A quiet state becoming a loud one is supposed to take a generation, not a season, which is exactly why a sudden, multi-state jump is so jarring. We are not talking about a region slowly accumulating its way up the list. We are talking about several states changing their behavior at once, inside a few months, fast enough that researchers noticed it as it was happening and reporters wrote it down. That speed is not how this map is supposed to move. The tempo itself is part of the anomaly. And that is exactly why this year matters. Because rules are only interesting when something breaks them. When reports start climbing in states that have almost none, in places with no real tradition of this, the change itself becomes the story. It is not more of the same, it is a different shape on the map. And a different shape demands a different explanation. The first crack in the map opened in Ohio, and it opened loudly. Earlier this year, a tight cluster of Bigfoot sightings began coming out of the northeastern part of the state, close enough together in time and place that researchers gave it a name. They're calling it the Ohio Flap of 2026. In this world, a flap means a sudden burst of sightings, concentrated, almost like a localized outbreak. What made this one different was who paid attention. The reports were collected and mapped by Jeremiah Byron, host of the Bigfoot Society podcast, who plotted the encounters and looked for a pattern. And then the story climbed somewhere these stories almost never reach. CNN ran a piece on it. a national news network treating a wave of Sasquatch reports as something worth covering seriously, quoting both a longtime investigator and a professional skeptic. That alone is worth pausing on. The mainstream press does not usually touch Bigfoot except to laugh at it. When a network like CNN sends a reporter to take the Ohio sightings seriously enough to map them and interview the people involved, something has shifted. The volume got loud enough that it could not be ignored. That is not proof of anything walking in the woods. But it is proof that the surge was real and big enough to register far outside the usual circles. It also did not happen in isolation in the culture. This year, Bigfoot has been everywhere at once. There's a documentary called Capturing Bigfoot that drew real attention. There's an off-Broadway musical. There are festivals with Sasquatch calling contests spreading into small towns from Oregon to Tennessee to Maine. Public radio ran segments on the whole phenomenon. The creature has been having a genuine cultural moment, and the Ohio flap landed right in the middle of it. That cultural noise cuts both ways, and we will come back to it hard later because it is the strongest argument that some of this surge is just people paying attention. But set the cause aside for a moment and notice the scale. When a wave of sightings in northeastern Ohio is making national news in the same year a documentary about Bigfoot is getting rave reviews, you are not looking at a few cranks. You are looking at something that broke through. And here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. Byron offered an explanation for why Ohio lit up the way it did. He suggested that a dramatic swing in the weather, a fast shift from winter into spring, may have put a group of these creatures on the move. A herd, in his words, pushed into new territory by changing conditions. Hold on to that idea. It is the seed of everything that follows.
This is the part people miss. The Ohio sightings were not just a fringe rumor. They were mapped by a researcher and covered by CNN. Whatever you think is behind it, the surge itself was real enough to make it to national news. Then there is the detail that genuinely unsettles me. The flap stopped almost as suddenly as it started. One stretch of weeks, report after report, and then quiet. That is not how hoaxes usually behave, because hoaxes feed on attention, and attention was peaking. And it is also not how misidentification usually behaves either. It switched on and it switched off, like something passing through and then gone. I personally think the on and off nature of it is the single strangest thing about Ohio. A steady drip of sightings you can explain a dozen ways.
But a sharp spike that arrives, peaks and vanishes, looks less like people imagining things and more like something physically moving into an area and then moving back out of it, which raises the obvious question, moving to where and from where? Compare it to how a hoax-driven wave actually behaves. When attention is the engine, sightings keep arriving as long as the attention lasts, and then they trail off slowly as interest fades, a long tail rather than a clean stop. The Ohio flap did not have a long tail, it cut off. That abruptness is the fingerprint of a physical cause rather than a social one. The difference between a thing leaving the area and a crowd losing interest. The crowd was still very much interested when the sighting stopped. That mismatch is what keeps me up about this case. While Ohio was making headlines, another state was quietly adding to the pattern. In February of 2026, a family in Oklahoma was out for a drive near the Washita River when they saw something cross the road ahead of them. Not in the dark, not as a blurry shape at the tree line. In daylight, an 8-foot-tall figure walking upright across a power line easement in full view. The account was picked up beyond the usual cryptid pages. It was covered by Outkick and discussed on the long-running paranormal radio program Coast to Coast, and it was framed by investigators as a top-tier sighting. the kind given the highest credibility rating, a clear, close daylight observation by multiple people in the same vehicle. No single witness to doubt. A whole family seeing the same thing at the same time. What strikes me about the Oklahoma case is the behavior. This was not something hiding. An open easement under power lines is about as exposed as terrain gets, the opposite of deep cover. And yet there it was, crossing in the daylight, reportedly pausing long enough to give the family a long look before it moved on. That is not a frightened animal bolting. That is something almost unbothered. And that detail, the pause, the look, recurs across these reports in a way that is worth dwelling on. In case after case this year, the figure does not flee. It registers the human, holds for a beat, and then withdraws on its own terms. Skeptics will say that is just how people remember a frightening encounter, dramatizing a glimpse into a stare. Maybe. But if you take the witnesses at their word, the consistent thread is a creature that behaves as though it has somewhere to be and is not especially afraid of being seen on the way there. For something supposedly defined by hiding, that is a strange posture to keep showing up in. Oklahoma, to be fair, is not a blank spot on the map. The southeastern corner of the state, the Kiamichi Mountains and the Ouachita National Forest, is a documented hotspot with its own deep history. Researchers from groups like the Mid-America Bigfoot Research Center and the North American Wood Ape Conservancy have worked that country for years. The Choctaw people have spoken of a tall, hair-covered figure in those hills for generations. That deep history is worth a moment because it tells you Oklahoma is not making this up wholesale this year. The record there goes back to the 1800s to trappers describing long-armed, stooped, grayish-black figures in the swamps and hills. In the 1920s, there were clusters of encounters, including hunters who claimed a man-beast killed their dog in the Kiamichi Range. Researchers who work that country point to the consistency across 150 years as evidence of a persistent population rather than a passing fad. So when a family on the Ouachita sees an 8-foot figure in 2026, it slots into a long local tradition rather than appearing from nowhere. That actually makes the report stronger, not weaker. This is not a place where one viral video suddenly invented a monster. It is a place with a documented, century-spanning record, adding one more daylight, multiple witness, high credibility entry to a very long list. The newcomer here is not Oklahoma, it is the timing. What matters is the timing. The Ouachita River encounter did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the same stretch of 2026 as Ohio, as Washington, as the others we're about to get to. Each case might be explainable on its own. It is the calendar that ties them together. They are all landing in the same window. Now we come to a twist, because the next state in our pattern is not an underdog at all. It is the champion. Washington, the single most active Bigfoot state in the entire country. You would expect Washington to always be loud. But that is not quite what happened this year, and the way it lit up tells us something. And its presence on this list is easy to dismiss for exactly the wrong reason. Of course, Washington had a sighting, you might think. Washington always has sightings, that proves nothing. But that reflex misses the point. We are not interested in whether Washington had a report. We are interested in the rhythm of when it did. A state with hundreds of reports on file is the perfect place to notice a change in tempo because it has the longest baseline to measure against. And against that baseline, the timing of this one stands out. In May of 2026, a solo motorist was driving near the community of Carson in the southern part of the state, close to the Oregon border, when he saw a figure standing near Wind River Road. He described it as a reddish-brown, furry shape, upright, positioned near a large boulder that looked as though it had been rolled toward the highway. The report was logged with a BFRO, classified as a high credibility Class A sighting, given its own case number in the database. Here's the detail that matters. The reporting around this sighting noted that it was Washington's first credible report in quite a while. The most active Bigfoot state in the nation had gone quiet, and then, in the same season everything else was happening, it spoke up again. The heartland did not just keep humming along at its usual rate. It went silent, and then it spiked. That changes the shape of the whole thing. If this were simply a story about sightings spreading outward from the Pacific Northwest into new territory, you would expect the Northwest itself to stay constant, a steady source bleeding into the edges. But that is not the pattern. Washington went quiet and then loud, right alongside the newcomers. The whole map seems to be pulsing at the same time, not radiating from one fixed center. And a pulse is a very different thing from a spread. A spread has a source and a direction, something starting in one place and pushing outward, and you can trace it back to an origin. A pulse has no center. It is the whole system reacting together, the way a pond does not ripple from one spot when the rain starts, but dimples all over at once. If Washington were just feeding the outliers, you would see a wave moving across the map. Instead, you see the map flickering on everywhere together. Whatever this is, it does not have one address. It has all of them. I personally think the Washington case is the quiet key to this whole thing, and it is the one people overlook because a sighting in Washington sounds like the least surprising news on Earth. But that is exactly why it matters. The state that should never go quiet went quiet, and then rejoined the chorus at the same moment as states that barely have a chorus at all. The center and the edges move together. That is the detail that turns 5 separate stories into one. A single figure by a boulder on a roadside is a small thing. On its own, it is one more report in a database full of them, but place it on the calendar next to Ohio and Oklahoma, and it stops being one more report. It becomes another beat in a rhythm. And the rhythm is what we are chasing. To call this a 5-state pattern, we need the states that have no business being on the list at all. The stronghold spiking is strange. The real outliers are stranger because they are the places where a credible report has the least precedent, the spots on the map that are supposed to stay dark. And this year, they did not. Montana is the first of them. Big sky country, enormous wilderness, and yet a relatively thin record of sightings compared to the giants. This year, reports surfaced of activity captured on cabin and trail cameras in remote parts of the state, the kind of automated, unblinking equipment people set up and forget about. A camera does not get scared, it does not embellish. It records whatever crosses in front of it at whatever hour and waits to be checked. That, to me, is what gives the Montana thread its weight. A human witness can be doubted, can be tired, can be primed by a story they heard around a fire. A motion-triggered camera in an empty stretch of forest has no imagination to fool. When that kind of equipment starts catching large, upright figures in a state without much of a tradition for it, the displacement looks less like contagious storytelling and more like something physically being where it had not been before. It also matters that Montana sits where it does. This is the northern Rockies, vast and thinly peopled. The kind of country where an animal could move for miles without crossing a single road. If the herd on the move idea has any truth to it, Montana is exactly the sort of corridor a large population would use. Open wilderness connecting one range to the next. A spike here is not just an extra data point. It is a spike in precisely the place a migration theory would predict, if there were anything to migrate. The second outlier reaches into the mountain west, where the Uinta Range in Utah has seen its own surge in reports this year, complete with collected footprint casts, and the occasional hair sample handed to local research groups. Many of these were night encounters, witnesses describing large humanoid shapes that seemed to melt back into the dark. A region that is not a household name for this, suddenly generating a body of fresh accounts. Utah is its own kind of strange addition because the Uintas are high country, a landscape of alpine basins and thin air, rather than the dripping lowland forest people picture when they imagine Bigfoot habitat. If the creature or the phenomenon were tied tightly to one type of environment, you would not expect it to bloom in the high desert mountains the same season it blooms in a Pacific rainforest and an Oklahoma river bottom. The spread across radically different landscapes is part of what makes the timing so hard to wave away.
Trail cameras in Montana, footprint casts in Utah, a daylight family sighting in Oklahoma. These are different kinds of evidence in different states with different witnesses. But what they have in common is the calendar.
Regular viewers of this channel will remember we covered an earlier flap in detail, a tight burst of sightings in Portage County, Ohio, that we looked at alongside trail camera material a while back. What is happening now feels like that, scaled up and spread out. Not one county catching fire, but a whole scatter of states doing it together. The same kind of event, but national instead of local, and that change in scale is the entire reason this video exists. Add it all up and the geography stops cooperating with the easy explanations. Ohio in the industrial Midwest, Oklahoma in the South Central Plains and Hills, Washington on the Pacific Edge, Montana in the Northern Rockies, Utah in the high desert mountains. These places do not share a border. They do not share an ecosystem. They do not share a culture or a weather system or a season that arrives at the same time. The only thing they share is the year. Look at where these 5 states actually are. They do not touch. They do not share a climate or a landscape. By every rule we know, their sightings should not line up. And yet here they are, lined up. And I want to be honest about the limits here, because this channel does not trade in fake certainty. Some of these outlier reports are stronger than others. The Ohio flap and the Oklahoma family sighting are well documented and widely covered. The trail camera and Mountain West material is more the kind of thing that comes through researchers and local groups, harder to nail down to a single verified moment. I am not going to pretend a hair sample is a confession, but the cluster taken as a whole is real and it is unusual. That distinction matters, and I want you to hold it as we move into the explanations, because a weak case and a strong case are not the same, and I will not pretend otherwise. If this were only the soft material, the uncatalogued trail cam clips, and the secondhand casts, I would tell you it was probably noise and move on. It is not only that. It is anchored by daylight, multiple witness, news-covered events, with the softer reports clustering around them in the same window. The anchors are what make the cluster worth taking seriously. The rest is texture. So let us do the thing this channel actually exists to do. Let us take the pattern seriously enough to try to break it. Because if there is an ordinary explanation that accounts for 5 states lighting up at once, we owe it to ourselves to find it before we reach for anything stranger. There are 4 real candidates, and each one explains a piece. The trouble is what each one leaves behind. And I want to be clear about the standard I'm holding these to. I'm not asking each explanation to be impossible. I'm asking whether it can carry the specific thing that makes this cluster unusual, which is not that sightings happened, but that they happened in 5 disconnected places in the same season. Plenty of theories can explain a sighting. The bar here is higher. The bar is the synchronization. Keep that test in mind as we go, because it is the test every one of these candidates ends up failing in the same place. The first and strongest is habitat loss and displacement. This is the rational backbone of the whole thing. Logging, development, and human pressure push large animals out of shrinking ranges and into new territory, where they suddenly become visible to people who never saw them before. It fits beautifully with Jeremiah Byron's idea about Ohio, a population on the move, forced into the open. If something large does live in these woods, squeezing its range would absolutely produce a spike in sightings. And it has the advantage of being a real, observed mechanism for known animals. We watch it happen constantly. Coyotes in cities, bears in suburbs, mountain lions turning up in places they were absent from for decades, all of it driven by habitat pressure forcing wildlife into human space. As an explanation for why you would suddenly start seeing a forest animal at the roadside, displacement is not a stretch at all. It is arguably the most scientifically respectable idea in this entire video, which is why it is worth being honest about where it falls short. But displacement has a hole in it, and the hole is the calendar. Habitat loss is slow and local. It does not flip a switch in 5 non-adjacent states in the same season. Why would forest pressure in Ohio synchronize with forest pressure in Utah and the disappearance of cover in Montana, all timed to the same few months of 2026? Displacement explains why a single region might light up. It does not explain why 5 of them light up together. There is a version of the displacement argument that tries to patch this. Maybe the country as a whole crossed some threshold this year, a tipping point in cumulative habitat pressure that happened to register everywhere at once. It is possible. But it is also the kind of explanation that quietly assumes the conclusion. To make habitat loss explain a synchronized national spike, you have to invent a synchronizing national trigger. And once you are doing that, you have left the simple version of the theory behind. The second candidate is weather, the specific trigger Byron named. A violent swing from winter to spring, an unusually hard season, something that pushes animals to relocate. This one is more promising on timing because weather can move across the country in a way that local logging cannot. A rough, abrupt season could plausibly nudge wildlife everywhere at roughly the same time. It is the best answer we have for the synchronization, and yet even weather strains under the weight of it. Seasonal shifts happen every single year. Animals move every spring. What we are trying to explain is not movement, but an unusual, news-making, 5-state spike in one particular year. For weather to be the answer, this year's shift would need to be dramatically out of the ordinary, and it would need to hit a Pacific rainforest, a southern plain, and a high desert range in the same way. That's a lot to ask of one season. There is also a question weather quietly leaves unanswered, which is why these animals, if they are animals, would respond to a hard season by walking toward people instead of away from them. Most wildlife under environmental stress becomes harder to see, not easier, retreating deeper into cover and conserving energy. A spike in sightings means a spike in encounters with humans, which means whatever is being seen moved toward roads and easements and cabins rather than away from them. Weather can explain movement. It has a harder time explaining movement in that particular direction. If you have found this walk through the evidence worth your time, take a second to subscribe and ring the bell, because this channel digs into exactly these patterns, the cases the mainstream picks up for a day and then drops, and we are following this one as it develops. Now to the explanation, a lot of you are already typing in the comments. The third candidate is the simplest and most deflating. Attention. Once Ohio hit CNN, once Bigfoot was back in the national conversation, more people went looking, more people interpreted an ambiguous shape in the woods as the thing they had just seen on the news, and more of them bothered to file a report. Virality manufactures its own evidence. A surge of sightings can simply be a surge of looking. It is a strong argument, and I will not wave it away because some of this spike is surely exactly that. But it has one fatal gap. The earliest Ohio reports came before the national coverage, not after. The attention followed the sightings, it did not create them. Virality can amplify a wave that already exists. It cannot reach back in time and start one. Something got the cluster going before the cameras ever showed up. And the attention theory has a second weakness that gets less notice. If the surge were purely a product of people looking, you would expect it to concentrate where the looking is loudest. In the strongholds, in the states already saturated with Bigfoot culture. Instead, some of the strangest reports come from the outliers, the states with the least built-in audience and the fewest people primed to file a report. Attention should light up the places already watching. It struggles to explain why the quiet states lit up too. The fourth candidate is the one science actually endorses: misidentification, and specifically bears. A black bear standing upright, seen at distance or in bad light, is a genuinely convincing Bigfoot. A 2024 study in the Journal of Zoology made the case that bear populations and sighting reports overlap in telling ways. For a large fraction of cases, this is almost certainly the real answer, and any honest look has to grant it. But the bear explanation thins out against the strongest cases in this cluster. An 8-foot figure crossing an open easement in clear daylight, watched by a whole family who would presumably recognize a bear. An upright form by a roadside boulder seen close enough to describe its color and posture. These are not glimpses in the fog. The best reports in this pattern describe something a standing bear does not quite cover. And there is a deeper problem with leaning on bears for this particular puzzle. Even if every single sighting in all 5 states were a misidentified bear, you would still have to explain the timing. Bears did not coordinate a 5-state appearance schedule for 2026. If the surge is bears, then something this year made people across the country suddenly start seeing bears as Bigfoot all at once, which just relocates the mystery from the woods into human behavior without actually dissolving it. The synchronization survives even the most skeptical answer. Every one of these explanations is doing real work. Habitat loss, weather, attention, bears. Each one accounts for part of the surge. Not one of them accounts for the timing, for why 5 separate states all spiked in the same season. So strip away everything the ordinary explanations can carry and look at what is left standing. 5 states with no shared border and no shared ecosystem. Credible reports, some of them caught on equipment that cannot lie, and some witnessed by whole families in broad daylight. A spike that arrives and in Ohio's case departs with unsettling sharpness. And above all, the timing. The thing none of the easy answers can hold. The synchronization. Notice that every explanation failed at the same seam. Habitat loss could not time it. Weather could time it, but could not aim it. Attention came too late to start it and ignored the wrong states. Bears could not survive the daylight cases and could not coordinate a national schedule. 4 different theories, 4 different strengths, and all 4 breaking on the exact same rock. When every road out of a mystery dead ends at the same wall, the wall is worth looking at directly. And the wall here is the calendar. This is the part that researchers gesture at carefully and rarely say plainly. Byron's idea was about movement, a herd pushed onto the road by the weather. Follow that thought to its end, and it stops being comforting. Because if something is genuinely moving in a coordinated way across enormous distances in the same season, then the real questions are not about any single sighting. They're about what is doing the moving and why it is all happening now. And coordinated is the word that should bother you if any of this is real. A single population shifting its range is one thing. 5 spikes in 5 disconnected states in one season implies either an enormous distribution moving in concert or a shared trigger reaching all of them at once, or simply a coincidence wearing the costume of a pattern. Every one of those possibilities is unsettling in its own way. The mundane one, coincidence, asks you to accept a very tidy accident. The other two ask you to accept that something out there is responding on a continental scale to a signal we cannot see. I personally think the honest answer is the one nobody finds satisfying. We do not know. Not in the lazy way people say that to end a conversation, but in the specific, uncomfortable way where you have ruled out the simple explanations one by one and found that a residue survives every cut. Habitat loss cannot time it. Weather strains too. Attention came too late. Bears cannot cover the best cases, and still 5 states lit up at once. Maybe it really is just a bad season and a viral news cycle stacking on top of each other in a way that looks like a pattern but is not. That is the boring answer, and the boring answer is sometimes the true one. But I keep coming back to the shape of it, the way it switched on across the map together. Coincidence is real, but coincidence does not usually arrange itself this neatly across 5 states that have nothing else in common. There is a principle worth keeping in mind here, one that cuts both ways. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine. It will see a face in a cloud and a conspiracy in a coincidence, and a cluster of 5 states is exactly the kind of thing it loves to connect whether or not the connection is real. I know that. I'm holding that thought the entire time I look at this. And even holding it, even discounting for my own hunger to find a shape, the timing still bothers me. That is the honest position. Skeptical of the pattern, and still unable to make it go away. We are not done with this one. The reports are still coming in, and there's a next chapter I want to chase. The question of timing within the day rather than the year. The recurring claim that so many of these encounters cluster around the same dark hours before dawn. That is a video for another week, and it might tell us something about what kind of pattern we are really looking at. Stay close for that one. For most of the time, people have been arguing about Bigfoot. The argument at least had stable ground under it. There was a map, there were rules, the sightings clustered where the forests were deepest and the stories were oldest. And whether you believed or not, you knew where to point. The Pacific Northwest, the strongholds, the places it was supposed to be. That map does not look the same anymore. In one season, 5 states with nothing in common have started reporting the same tall, dark, upright figure all within the same handful of weeks. A family on a Sunday drive, a man alone by a roadside boulder, a trail camera in empty country, a national news network sending a reporter to take it seriously. The shape on the map has changed, and nobody can fully say why. Every ordinary explanation we have covers a corner of it and leaves the center untouched. The timing refuses to resolve, and the reports have not stopped. Whatever this pattern is, it does not look finished. Something is showing up in places it has no history of being, and it is doing it everywhere at once. And the only honest thing to say is that we are watching it happen in real time, and we do not yet know what it means. And there is something almost fitting about that, given what we are talking about. For more than a century, this creature has been defined by a single quality above all others: the refusal to be pinned down. Every time the evidence seems about to close, it slips. The Ohio flap is a small version of the same thing. It surged, it made the news, it pulled in a national audience, and then it dissolved before anyone could turn it into proof.
The pattern shows you its shape and then refuses to explain itself. That is the most Bigfoot thing about this whole affair. So keep your eyes on the tree line this year, wherever your tree line happens to be, because the old rule that this only happens somewhere far away in someone else's forest is the rule that just broke. I'm Alex, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.